The sound of the doorbell echoed through the old thrift store, announcing the arrival of Lucas, a 12-year-old boy with dirty sneakers and a backpack slung haphazardly over his shoulders. He had ventured in out of pure curiosity, on a cloudy afternoon that seemed to invite him to escape the dull routine of school and his empty house. The thrift store was located in the most forgotten part of the city, one of many second-hand shops, where old items were scattered across dusty shelves as if abandoned by time. Lucas had always liked old things: hardcover books, broken radios, creaky wooden chairs. They held a certain mystery, like they carried stories that could only be unlocked by those willing to explore their secrets. But nothing in his entire life had caught his attention quite like a VHS tape lying in a dark corner of the store. It was alone, with no protective case, no label, just a black tape wrapped in a dirty, crumpled cover. Lucas's gaze fixed on it, for no particular reason. He knew it couldn't be just any tape. His instinct told him it was special, but in the wrong way. He didn't know why, but something about that tape seemed to have an invisible energy, something that called him to touch it. The dim light from the thrift store reflected off the darkened plastic, as if it had been waiting for him. "Hey, kid, you gonna take that?" asked the old woman behind the counter, her voice raspy and weary. Lucas hesitated for a moment, but the urge to take the tape was stronger. With a nod, he grabbed it and slipped it into his backpack. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Deep down, he knew he couldn't leave that object behind. As he left the store, the cold wind felt heavier, as if the very air were saturated with something dark. But he ignored the chill running down his spine and continued on his usual path home. Deep inside, he felt a growing excitement, a strange sense that something important was about to happen. When he got home, his mom wasn't there. She always left in the late afternoon for work, and Lucas was left alone, surrounded by the heavy silence of the empty house. He went upstairs to his room, threw his backpack onto the bed, and pulled out the tape. He stared at it for a while, his eyes fixed on the blank label, trying to imagine what it could be. Why would someone get rid of something like this? A tape with no title, no clue as to what it was, seemed like a lost puzzle piece, waiting to be put together. Without thinking too much, Lucas grabbed the vase player tucked away on the shelf, a relic from his childhood, and plugged the tape in. He pressed play and settled onto the bed, already feeling a growing anxiety. The TV screen went black for a few seconds. Then, a distorted image appeared, filled with static. The colors danced on the screen, a mix of blues and greens that seemed to writhe. Lucas furrowed his brow. What was this? The screen flickered, and for a brief moment, he thought the tape had malfunctioned. But then something strange happened. A shadow formed on the screen, an indistinct figure that seemed to be watching him. He tried adjusting the remote, but it was no use. Something was wrong. "It's just an old tape," he muttered to himself, trying to shake off the growing fear that was settling in his chest. But as the video played on, he couldn't look away. Something kept him there, glued to the screen, as if he were hypnotized. The figure on the screen moved slowly, fading into the shadows, and then the image disappeared completely, leaving only the sound of static in the background. Lucas felt a chill run down his spine, but he stayed where he was, unable to turn off the TV. He knew something had changed, but he didn't understand what. Lost in his thoughts, trying to process what he had just seen, an unsettling feeling took over him. There was something in the air, something that felt watched. He looked around, feeling the weight of the silence in the house, and deep in his mind, he knew that tape wasn't just a tape. Something was hiding within it, still trying to push away the growing fear. Lucas turned off the TV and threw himself onto the bed, staring at the ceiling. But before he could lose himself in other thoughts, he heard a noise, a whisper, soft but unmistakable. He raised his head quickly. The voice seemed to be coming from the direction of the TV, as if something were calling him. The clock on the wall seemed to tick louder, heavier, and the silence now held an unusual tension. Whatever it was, he couldn't deny. There was something in that tape, something that was watching him. Lucas couldn't sleep that night. The sound of the tape still echoed in his mind, a whisper blending with the ticking of the clock and the very silence of the house. He tossed and turned in bed, eyes wide open, staring at the shadows dancing on the walls from the streetlight filtering through the window. The cold he had felt while watching the video now seemed to spread across his whole body, as if something invisible were touching him with every movement he made. When he finally fell asleep, it wasn't into a peaceful rest. His nightmares were consumed by the image of the static screen and the shadow watching it. He saw quick flashes of distorted faces, of figures moving in the shadows, but when he tried to get closer to understand what was happening, everything would dissolve into an explosion of static, the sound of the tape turning into a deafening wave. He would wake up after each nightmare, heart racing, drenched in cold sweat, but always feeling that presence, as if he weren't alone. The next morning, he tried to forget about what had happened the night before. School was waiting, and his friends would talk about trivial things, games, who was hanging out with whom. He didn't need to think about the tape, but he couldn't. Something was there, always lurking, in the back of his mind. When he got home later, he went straight to his room, but before doing anything, he looked at the TV. The tape was on the bed, exactly where he had left it the night before. Curious, he picked it up again, running his fingers over the blank label. The label was spotless, as if no one had ever touched it. For some reason, Lucas decided to put it in the VHS player once more. The TV screen lit up with the same distortion as before. The buzz of static filled the air, but this time it was different. He noticed that the shadow on the screen seemed more defined, more solid. A dark figure was forming in the corner of the screen, moving slowly, as if it were coming out of the tape itself. Lucas leaned in closer to the TV, his breath growing heavier. The figure looked human. He couldn't tell. It was the outline of something or someone that was distorting, as if being pulled from a place beyond the screen. I should stop this, he thought, but somehow his hand still held the remote. Suddenly, the figure on the screen stopped moving, locking its gaze directly on Lucas, as if it were watching him. The air grew heavy. He felt a growing sense of unease, as if he were being drawn into the screen. Fear overtook his body, but he couldn't look away. The figure on the TV, now completely still, seemed to be waiting for something. Then, with a sudden jolt, the screen went black. Silence filled the room, but then the sound came. A faint noise, almost inaudible, coming from the corner of the room where the TV was. It was like a whisper. Lucas turned quickly, but the room was empty. He looked at the TV, but the screen was off, without any sign of life. The sound stopped as abruptly as it had started. The feeling of being watched returned, stronger than before. Breathing heavily, Lucas took a step back, but before he could move away from the TV, the sound came back. This time, louder, clearer. He stared at the screen, and then he saw it. A message, written in white letters, began to form slowly in the center of the screen, one letter at a time. What was being written seemed strange, as if it were an order, but it didn't make sense. You saw what you shouldn't. Lucas froze, his body numb, the fear crushing his mind. He didn't know what it meant, but he felt a deep chill run down his spine. What was happening? How was this possible? The TV was off, but the message still appeared before his eyes, as if it were real, as if the tape had turned into something alive. He tried to back away, but the static sound grew louder, as if it were trying to infiltrate his mind. The whisper, which had once seemed distant, now felt inside his head a soft, drawn-out voice calling him, almost as if it were saying his name. Before he could react, the screen flickered again. Distorted images appeared, and the figure on the screen was closer, almost coming out of the television, its eyes fixed on Lucas. He took a step back, but the room seemed to shrink, the walls slowly closing in, as if he were being swallowed by that dark void. His heart raced, and Lucas screamed at the TV, screamed for everything to stop, but it was as if no one was listening. The sound from the tape seemed to consume everything around him, and for a moment he felt lost, trapped in those images, in that never-ending nightmare. When he looked at the TV again, the figure had vanished. Everything was quiet once more. But Lucas knew on a visceral level that he wasn't free. Something was there with him, something that had come from that tape, something he couldn't ignore, and he knew that this was just the beginning. Lucas couldn't escape the feeling that something was watching him anymore. In the following days, he tried to go about his routine, but the weight of what he had seen on the TV never left him. He couldn't stop thinking about that message, "You saw what you shouldn't," and fear seemed to seep into every corner of his life. School felt distant, his classmates' conversations muffled and hollow. Even activities that had once been part of his daily life, like playing video games or watching movies, now felt like desperate attempts to fill the void the tape had left in his mind. When he was alone at home, the silence felt louder. It was as if everything around him was on hold, as if the air had become thicker, more oppressive. But the worst part was the night. Every time he closed his eyes, the image of the figure on the TV came back to his mind. It was as if it was inside his head, moving through his thoughts, watching him, waiting for something. And every time he tried to forget, the sound of the tape would invade his dreams, turning them into nightmares. He would wake up in the middle of the night, gasping for air, heart pounding, with the feeling that something was about to happen, like the clock was counting down to something or someone. That afternoon, after another day without answers, Lucas decided once again to put the tape in the VHS player. He didn't know why he was doing it. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was fear. Fear that if he didn't, things would get even stranger. But looking at the tape on the shelf, he knew there was no turning back. Something about that tape kept him trapped, as if an invisible force had started to shape his reality. He put it in the TV and turned on the VHS player. This time, the screen didn't stay static for long. Soon, an image appeared, a dark hallway, lit only by a faint light hanging from the ceiling. The sound was muffled, but Lucas could hear the echo of distant footsteps. It was as if someone were walking down that hallway, but the camera or the perspective was still, with no one visible. He felt a chill. Suddenly, the footsteps started getting closer, but with each step that sounded nearer, the light on the screen grew weaker, as if it was fading away. Lucas's heart raced. He knew something was wrong. The hallway was getting too close. The screen seemed to warp more and more, until, in the blink of an eye, the image shattered. Everything went completely silent. But soon after, the sound came back, louder, more unbearable. It was like a buzzing that turned into a distorted, low, deep laugh, as if the house itself was laughing at him. Lucas almost threw the remote away, but he couldn't move. His eyes were glued to the screen, which now showed nothing but an immense darkness. Then a voice whispered, soft and almost inaudible, "You shouldn't have called me." Lucas froze. That voice, he recognized it. It was the same voice he had heard at the bottom of his nightmare, the same voice that seemed to invade his mind. He looked at the TV, but there was nothing on the screen, just darkness. The house was silent, but Lucas felt the presence of something that had crawled out of the tape and into the real world. The buzzing sound started to take shape, growing louder and softer, as if something was trying to cross through the screen. The sound of footsteps in the house, slow, but getting closer, steps that couldn't be real. And then a laugh that seemed to come from inside his own head, distorted, made of nightmares. He got off the bed, sweat dripping down his face. He looked around, but the room was empty. The TV was still showing the blank black screen, lifeless. But Lucas knew he wasn't alone. Something was there. The laugh continued, now closer. He felt the air tightening in his lungs, and the walls seemed to close in warped, as if reality itself was folding. The buzzing of the vis now sounded like a scream, and the shadow he had seen before on the TV started to take shape slowly and menacingly, emerging from the screen. He couldn't breathe. His throat felt tight, as if an invisible pressure was crushing him. The sound of the tape became deafening, and he dropped to his knees, unable to move. All he could hear was that scream, that sound of something crossing the threshold between the real world and the other one, the one the tape had come from. "Lucas," the voice whispered again, now clearer than ever. He looked at the TV, and something moved quickly, a shadow crawling out of the screen, weaving around the furniture, surrounding him. He wanted to scream, run, but he couldn't. He was paralyzed, as if terror had blocked his body, leaving him utterly powerless. The shadow finally materialized in front of him. It was a human figure, but distorted, with irregular contours, as if it was made of something undefined. Its eyes, huge and dark, were fixed on Lucas, empty of any empathy, only pure, cold malice. "You called me," the voice said again, and Lucas felt as if reality was disintegrating around him. The figure took a step forward, and everything around Lucas began to darken. Lucas felt the air around him disintegrate, as if he was being absorbed by the darkness. He wanted to scream, but his throat was dry, caught by an invisible force that made him feel small and powerless. The figure in front of him seemed to float in space. Its eyes locked on Lucas with a terrifying intensity, as if it was watching every movement, every breath, waiting for something. The terror was so overwhelming that he could barely process what was happening. The static noise, now louder than ever, seemed to invade his mind, distorting his thoughts, stealing his ability to reason. He no longer knew where he was, or how this was even possible. The room, the house. Everything seemed to be slowly disappearing, as if he was sinking into an endless abyss. Then the figure spoke again, its voice a whisper that seemed to come from all directions. "You called me," it repeated, but now the voice carried a tone of disdain, as if it were enjoying Lucas's suffering. He tried to move, but his body didn't respond. His mind was in panic, wanting to escape, but there was no way out. The figure took another step forward, and Lucas felt the cold chill of its presence invade his body, as if he was being filled with something dark and heavy. He tried to look around, but there were no more walls, no ceiling, just a figure and him, immersed in an endless darkness. "You saw what you shouldn't have seen," the voice said now, clearer, stronger, as if it was feeding off the fear emanating from Lucas. "And now, you're part of it." The words cut through Lucas like knives. He felt a wave of despair flood his chest, and finally, his body responded. He moved away, but his legs were weak, stumbling as he tried to run anywhere. But when he looked at what had once been his room, he saw that everything was different. The walls were blurred, distorted, as if they were melting. The door, which had been there before, was gone, and now he was lost in an empty space, with no beginning, no end. The sound of the tape continued, now louder, more frantic. He tried to cover his ears, but the sound pierced his mind, as if it were the only thing that existed. The emptiness around him seemed to devour everything, and he was becoming more and more isolated. He felt like he was losing control of himself, as if his identity was being torn apart, fragmented, until he was nothing more than a shadow, an empty presence. "You don't understand, Lucas," the figure said, its voice now filled with a sick pleasure. "There's no more you. There's no going back." With desperate effort, Lucas looked down and saw something there, a thin line, like a thread of light. He moved toward it, struggling, feeling the weight of the darkness surrounding him. But his mind was determined. The thread of light was the only thing that seemed real. He followed it, step by step, until finally, when he reached it, something strange happened. The thread transformed, as if it were a door, and Lucas felt an increasing pressure, as if he was being pulled into it. He closed his eyes in desperation, but the sensation of being dragged was so strong that he couldn't resist. When he opened his eyes again, he was no longer in the room. He was no longer in his house. He was somewhere else. The environment around him was dark, undefined. But there was something familiar about the atmosphere, as if he was returning to a place he should never have left. He looked at his own arms, and the feeling of having been there before was unmistakable. But how? Where was he? How had he gotten there? The sound of the tape was still there, not as noise, but as a presence. He felt the vibration of the sound in every fiber of his being, as if he was bound to something he couldn't escape. He looked behind him, but there was no figure. The darkness seemed even deeper, but there was something there, watching him. Then, the sound stopped. Absolute silence. Lucas looked around, the fear now taking on a physical form, heavy, as if reality had crumbled around him. He was completely alone, but the feeling of being watched consumed him. He knew he wasn't truly alone. Something was waiting for him, something that came from the tape. Suddenly, a faint light appeared ahead, like a distant star, flickering in the vastness of the darkness. Lucas, driven by instinct, began walking toward it, hoping that it was the key to getting out of there. But as he got closer, he felt the weight of what was following him. He didn't know what it was, but he felt drawn to something worse than any nightmare he could imagine. He hesitated for a moment, but the light was the only thing that seemed real. He took another step, and when he did, the light went out, and the darkness deepened even further. Lucas was in the midst of darkness, completely alone, his breath pounding in his ears like a hammer striking a hollow drum. The light he had seen, although faint, disappeared without warning, leaving him submerged in a complete absence of everything. There was no sound, no movement, just the oppressive weight of solitude and the feeling that he was being watched. He forced his mind to think, to cling to any fragment of logic. The tape, the message he had heard. You saw what you shouldn't have seen. He felt the truth pulsing through his bones, but still couldn't fully grasp it. What was happening? Why was he here? And what, or who, was behind him? He couldn't let the same shadow reach him again. He couldn't let the darkness swallow him whole. His mind was collapsing, his thoughts fragmenting, as if they were being distorted and drifting far from reality. He no longer knew if he was dreaming or if this was real. But the fear, deep and primal fear, was the only thing keeping him alert, still searching for an escape. Then, suddenly, a sound erupted through the darkness, a sound so disturbing that it made Lucas shudder. It was a laugh, low, muffled, but clearly malicious. The same laugh he had heard in his nightmares. He looked around, but there was nothing, only the void. And yet, the laugh continued, reverberating in the dark. The fear began to turn into panic. He couldn't stay there any longer. He didn't know what was happening, but he knew he couldn't keep listening to that laugh, which seemed to mock his pain, his desperation. He started running, or at least trying to, but his feet didn't seem to touch the ground. The space around him seemed to stretch and contract, as if he were trapped in an endless nightmare, unable to distinguish where the ground began and where the void ended. The sound of the tape. He felt the hum creeping into his mind, stronger now, more present. The laugh mixed with the crackles and distorted noises of the tape. He felt the weight of that presence, as if it were getting closer and closer. But he still didn't know what it was. And he needed to know. He needed to understand. It was then, in the midst of the chaos, that he heard a voice. Not a normal voice, but a voice laden with something darker. Do you want to know the truth, Lucas? He stopped, frozen. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. And somehow, he knew that the tape was tied to everything that was happening. He needed to know what was going on, once and for all. You called me, the voice whispered again. Called me from the screen, and now you're trapped. He couldn't understand. But somehow, the words were starting to make sense. He had been drawn to that tape, to that evil beyond the screen. And now he was a part of it, part of something ancient and corrupt that had hidden itself in those images, waiting for someone like him. "You don't understand, Lucas," the voice continued, sounding farther away with each word. "The tape is not just a tape. It's a passage, a doorway to the other side. And now you're with me." Then, amidst the darkness, a figure appeared before him. Not a distorted shadow like before, but a solid form. It was a man from the tape, but now he was there, in the darkness, with the same empty eyes and cold presence. "I am what you should never have seen," he said, his voice cold and emotionless. "I am the echo of all those who saw the tape before you. And now, you are mine. You are part of me." Lucas tried to take a step back, but his feet were glued to the ground, as if the very space around him was merging with his body, trapping him in this distorted reality. He felt a pressure in his chest, a searing pain, as if his soul were being torn away. What do you want from me?" Lucas asked, his voice trembling. The man smiled, but it wasn't a smile of kindness. It was an empty, inhuman smile. "What do I want? I only want you to understand, Lucas. Understand that now you have nowhere to run. You have become part of something much greater. You have become part of the tape story." And then the images from the tape began to form around Lucas, as if the very reality itself was shaping itself from the images he had seen. The dark corridor, the footsteps, the shadows. Everything was materializing before him, like a nightmare coming to life. But now, he was the protagonist of the story, no longer just the observer. "Now, you're inside the tape," the voice said, each word a deep blow. "And the tape will never stop playing. Never." Lucas tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. The figure of the man vanished, and he was alone again, surrounded by the images from the tape, trapped in an endless cycle. He knew he would never escape. He was lost. The tape had won, and he would never see the light again. The sensation of being immersed in the tape was no longer something Lucas could ignore. Now, he was part of the screen, the fabric of reality and distorted images blending in his mind, filling him with a fear that he could not escape. Every piece of his consciousness was being corrupted by the tape, a prison with no bars, but still trapping him. He could no longer distinguish between what was real and what was the fiction of the tape. With every breath, he felt himself sinking deeper into the images, the scenes, the vision surrounding him. The dark corridor stood before him again, but now he could see it in a different way. It was as if he was part of that place, as if the walls and the floor were his own flesh. He forced himself to walk with heavy steps, and as he did, the images began to move around him. He was at the center of a scene that seemed to repeat endlessly, like a cycle of terror that would never end. The muffled laughter returned, but now it didn't come from a single direction. It was distant echoes reverberating through the walls, filling the space with a sense of collective despair. He was not alone. The others were there too. He could feel it. The shadows that once slithered in the corners were now closer, more defined. The emptiness he had felt inside him was being filled with something darker, an invisible yet tangible presence. He looked down at the floor and saw something strange. In the middle of the corridor, a VHS tape was lying there, covered in dirt and dust. But there was something different about it. The tape didn't seem like an ordinary recording. It was vibrating, as if it had a life of its own, pulsing in a rhythm that matched the beating of his heart. He crouched down to pick it up, but his hand hesitated before touching the cold surface of the tape. Something was stopping him, a feeling that touching it would mean his final downfall. But the voice, that cold, hollow voice, returned. "Pick it up. You know there's no choice left." The will to resist drained from Lucas, as if the tape held a power over him. He took it, and the moment his fingers touched the tape, a wave of pain surged through him, as if something were tearing him apart from the inside. He could no longer go back. He felt the presence of the man from the tape behind him, watching every movement with a patience only death could possess. The tape, now in Lucas's hands, seemed to grow in size. It expanded before him, more and more, as if it were consuming the space, distorting everything around him. The images on the tape began to come to life again, and Lucas saw, this time with terrifying clarity, what was really happening. He was trapped in a cycle of repetition. There was no longer any line between reality and nightmare. He was part of the tape now, and there was no escape. He began to see scenes of people who, like him, had fallen into the trap, condemned to relive the same night, the same images forever. He saw distorted faces, twisted in expressions of pain and despair, all of them looking at him with hollow eyes, as if they knew exactly what he was going through. "You're seeing it," the voice whispered behind him. "Now you understand. You'll never leave here." Lucas tried to scream, but his mouth produced no sound. He was trapped in an endless screen, forced to watch the same images, repeated and repeated until he lost all sense of time, of who he was. He no longer knew if this was a punishment or an eternal damnation. The man from the tape, now a shapeless shadow, approached Lucas, his presence overwhelming, until he was completely surrounded. "You're no longer Lucas," the man whispered. "You're just a memory now, a part of the tape, and the tape will never stop." The last image Lucas saw was his own face, twisted in pain and despair, frozen in a frame, an echo of what he had once been. He was trapped in an endless loop, condemned to live the same night, the same pain, the same fear, forever. After Lucas's last breath, the tape kept spinning, his image frozen on the screen, an unshakable memory, a scar in the fabric of time. And for anyone who, like him, found that tape, the cycle would begin again. They too would be consumed by the presence that lived within it. For each person who saw the tape, a new shadow would join those already lost in the darkness. And so, the tape would continue its existence, forever,